everyone, and welcome back to People Do Wanna Know podcast. Today's guest is an amazing educator, activist, and a person I've wanted to have on for a very long time, Charlotte Korchak. Let me start by reading you her bio. Charlotte Korchak is the founder and senior educator of the Jerusalem Education Institute, a nonprofit organization working to transform education on Israel and the Middle East. As an accomplished educator and speaker specializing in Israeli history, effective communication, and anti-Semitism, Charlotte captivates audiences with her passionate speaking style and the ability to break down the most challenging concepts, making them accessible to a wide range of audiences. Additionally, she earned her BA in Middle Eastern History from the University of Southern California, where she also participated in the Stand With Us Emerson Fellowship. Charlotte began working at Stand With Us in 2010, where she eventually engaged over 50,000 students annually, both online and on 5 different continents, ending her time there as the international senior educator. Often described as a walking encyclopedia, Charlotte's 15 years of expertise leaves audiences feeling educated, empowered, and more capable of engaging with their peers on these difficult issues. She has quickly become an acclaimed public speaker in her field. I would consider this bio incredibly accurate in how I think of Charlotte. Many of the talking points I use personally to discuss Israel and anti-Semitism came from years of watching Charlotte speak to it at Stand With Us. I am so glad that she has been able to branch off and start her new adventure, JEI, and I think she will be incredibly successful. Also, it just makes me happy to see women pursue their entrepreneurial passions, especially in a space where I feel like women just notoriously get spoken over. Anyway, as of like a month ago, maybe more at this point, Charlotte had a huge moment of virality when she went for the first time to visit Auschwitz. She was there with a group of students on an organized trip, and as they were leaving, they gathered together and held an Israeli flag. That's when a woman approached them and started saying that Israel's killing children and asked if Charlotte is ashamed. Charlotte posted the altercation online as well as her thoughts, and I highly recommend you go and watch that video. She reflects about this incident at length in the episode, and she talks about how she played it over and over in her head and she wished that she handled it differently. But I have to say, as an outsider, I still think she handled it very appropriately. She didn't make any personal attacks. She defended her students and defended us as the Jewish people. And as someone who is overly critical of content of myself online, Charlotte, I want you to know that any reasonable person watching that video would feel pride for how you handled that, and I know that I did. In this episode, you'll hear Charlotte talk about the difference between education and activism, the importance of sharing facts to students without drawing a conclusion or judgment from them. The time for education is now. The time to be able to defend our people and Israel articulately is now. No one is asking you to be an expert, but you gotta have a baseline of understanding and education. Let Charlotte's story be the inspiration we need that we can be educators or activists, whatever it is that we want to be, too. Please enjoy this episode. Hey, Charlotte, welcome to People Do Wanna Know podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Where are you in the world right now?
I am in Champaign, Illinois. So I just moved here. My boyfriend works at the University of Illinois as the head coach of the men's gymnastics team. So I just recently relocated here from Israel at the beginning of this year.
Wow, that is so exciting. I hope you love it, but I know that it's a big change.
Huge change, tiny town. I mean, I guess you could say after the chaos of Israel for the last 12 years, it's a nice, quiet place to be. Again, very zen, but it's hard. I've never lived in a small town. I've only lived in big cities. So it's definitely a transition for me. But yeah.
That makes total sense. I'm very excited to dig into your story. So without further ado, tell us about yourself. What do you do and how did you get there?
So I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I lived in LA until I was 9 in a very classic Jewish bubble, obviously one of the largest populations in the world, Jewish populations in the world. Both my parents actually converted to Judaism. So part of my family is not Jewish, but really lived in a Jewish bubble. When I was 9, my parents decided to uproot me and my 4 older siblings and move us to Israel. So we moved to Israel. We lived in Israel for 5 years. Our first year was actually in a settlement or a Jewish community in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. We lived there for a year, realizing that small towns were really not for us. And then we moved to the biggest city we could find, which was Jerusalem. Lived in Jerusalem for 4 more years. And it was during that time that the Second Intifada breaks out, about 2 years into us living in Jerusalem. So really what if you ask the question of how I got to where I am, really a big part of what shaped me was my experience living through the Second Intifada. Unfortunately, a year and a half into the Second Intifada, I lost 3 friends in one suicide bombing, which again will really kind of shape my story. Not that I knew then, but I will discover later on in life. And then, unfortunately, after almost 2 years of the Intifada, my family couldn't survive in Israel anymore. The economy had crashed. So we moved back to the United States. And I always say we moved from Jerusalem to Las Vegas. So from the holy city to the city of sin, which was very weird. I did a year of high school in Vegas and then 2 more years of high school in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. And then I went off to university. I went to the University of Southern California, where I had no idea what I wanted to do when I started at USC. I went there because my dad had gone there and because it was a school that really offered you to kind of dabble in a lot of different schools and a lot of different classes and really figure out what you wanted to do with your life. You could even create your own major at USC. And about 6 months into my time at USC, I was walking on campus one day and I came face to face with an apartheid wall that was put up demonizing and delegitimizing Israel. I didn't realize it maybe that day, but I had kind of this aha moment of realizing that I, first of all, knew very little to nothing about Israel and had no idea how to defend Israel from the accusations that were being lobbed against her. And I also woke up to the fact that I was really passionate about Israel, like that I wanted to defend Israel. I wanted to stand up and I wanted to say something. And I hated the fact that I didn't know what to say. And so that's what really started me on my journey. I was 18 years old when that happened. And it started me off on this crazy journey that I've been on now for 20 years. I just turned 38 a couple of weeks ago. And it really became a journey of Israel activism that turned into a journey of Israel education. And so what I do now is I just founded my own education nonprofit called the Jerusalem Education Institute, which is essentially here to renovate Israel education for the next generation. It's an organization meant to take a deep dive into Israel education and not for any other purpose than education, right? There's education for politics, there's education for think tanks, there's education for activism. But education for education's sake is just education to learn, to understand, to deepen your understanding of Israel, of Zionism, of the Middle East, of Jewish history, Jewish peoplehood, and of course of antisemitism. And I got here by working the last 15 years with Stand With Us, an organization that is still near and dear to my heart. I was very much a child of Stand With Us. I grew up in the organization. I became an activist with Stand With Us when I was on my college campus. And after 15 years, I decided I just kind of wanted to forge my own path. And so that's how I got to where I am. Sorry, a bit of a long story. It's not so simple because of all my moves, but that was my journey to get me to where I am today. Yeah. And I should say I moved back to Israel at 25. So a few years after I started working for Stand With Us. And I lived in Israel for the last 12 years until we just talked about me recently relocating, which was really difficult given what I do and given how much I love Israel. But it was the right move at the right time for me. So hopefully I'll end up back there one day. But for now, it's Champaign, Illinois. It's home.
The name of your nonprofit is also a wonderful homage to where you kind of started your first big Jewish life as a 9-year-old, which I think is very beautiful. And what interests me most is we've had on this podcast quite a few different people that specialize in Jewish education. I've had Melissa Mott, I've had Dara Horn, people that have hot takes about Jewish education and can clearly articulate what the problems are. And I think at this point, my audience roughly knows that one, there are problems, many, and two, what they are and how to speak to them. And what I'm curious about is talk to me about the solutions you're coming up with, because it's no secret that like Hasbara doesn't work. Hasbara is cringe. We need a different talking point. The stuff that you saw on campus as a student happened years before any kind of violence in Israel. It was a calculated, well-planned indoctrination of generations of students on major campuses in the US. Our education system has been infiltrated. I don't know how else to put it. That is the word I use. Tell me about your work and the solutions you're hoping to bring. What is your method? What is your approach?
So first of all, I already want to shift a little bit because you kept talking about Jewish education. And I think actually one of the problems of Israel education is that it is always lumped in with Jewish education. And I think that is problem number one, right? I go into many Jewish day schools and I say, when does the story start? And when it comes to Israel, I don't say the Jewish people. I say, well, the Jewish story. When does the Jewish story begin? And everyone says Abraham. And I'm like, beautiful. I love that you've learned about Abraham. I've loved that you learned our theological story. But I can't say that to somebody who doesn't believe in God. I can't prove that Abraham exists, right? So there's Jewish education, which is, it starts with Jewish theology and then eventually it becomes actual factual history about the Jews. And then there's Israel education, which of course I would say under Jewish education should come Israel education. But at the same time, Israel education also needs to live on its own. And that's problem number one, I would say. So already, I mean, there are amazing people. You listed some. Daryl Horn is incredible, and what she's doing for Jewish education is really important. I wouldn't say that that's my expertise. My expertise is Israel. How do we teach Israel? How do we teach the Middle East? And most importantly, how do we teach Zionism? And what I found is, first of all, we're starting too late. So let's start there. We start too late with actual education. We do really well with pride. Early on, first grade, second grade, if you go to a Jewish day school, like you're going to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, and the Israel's going to be part of your education throughout, because part of, again, just learning about Jewish culture is you're going to learn about Israel. At some point, you're going to sit in a classroom with the 7 species, right, of the land of Israel that are hanging up on the wall. And so there's this natural connection, but we leave out like just the facts. It's almost like we infantilize the youth and say, well, we'll get there later. It's too complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. Math is also really complicated, right? Math, you get up to the level of trigonometry and then calculus, and then there's even more stuff that I don't even know because I never learned it, because that's how complicated it is. But we don't say it's too complicated. So we're not going to start in first grade with math. Let's wait, right, until later, and then we'll start teaching math. No, right? Because everything can be simplified. Everything needs to start with a 1 + 1 = 2, which is why I love math, because it's so formulaic. And I would like the exact same thing to happen with Israel education. So again, from first grade, you should already start to talk about Zionism and what that word means, right? And I have a very simple definition for Zionism that I give, that I say is my 1 + 1 = 2 definition, which is the belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. I'm pretty sure you could teach that to a first grader. I'm pretty sure you could teach it to a second grader. And I'm pretty sure that if you started in first grade and you continued to repeat that definition every year, and it was part of the conversation, but every year you made it a little bit more complicated and you added some more layers to it, just like you'll start with addition, but then you'll get to subtraction, and then you'll get to multiplication, you'll get to division, then you'll get to long division. Oh, here we are, right? We have to get better at first starting younger and making it formulaic to the point that they actually remember what we're teaching them. And that's why you remember 1 + 1 = 2, and you remember addition, and you remember multiplication. You don't remember calculus anymore because you don't use it. But the others you used, and you had to keep using them every year to get to the next stage. It needs to be the same thing with Israel education and with Zionism education. And so that's what really we need to solve, is how do we build it into the curriculum where it's not overwhelming, where you don't have to have a class on Israel every single year, but it's woven into other classes that are already there. Right? When it comes to world history or ancient history, or there's always a way that you could weave it in. And then it's a matter of repetition so that we remember it. And this is the key, because that way, when they get to 8th grade, 9th grade, all of a sudden we can start talking about the complexity, the challenges, and the debates within Zionism, and the challenges within Israeli history. And you could start to open up some of the more difficult conversations, because then by the time they're in 11th and 12th grade, they are critical thinkers about Israel. They feel like they're not just learning something, but that they are part of something. They are part of the Zionist movement. They are part of Israeli history. And they get to decide what it's going to look like in the future if they want to actually be a part of it. And that's huge, to give a kid, a student in high school, that kind of agency to help him understand, like, you don't have to be okay with what's going on right now. You have a say. Just like Ben-Gurion was just some dude who became Ben-Gurion, right? He just had thoughts and he wrote them down and he spread them. And people started to listen to him. You could be that person too. For me, again, if I have to sum it up, it's we have to start younger. It has to be more formulaic, okay? And then get to the point where we can have those critical conversations before people step out and go off to university, right? And lastly, teachers have to check their egos and their opinions at the door. And I'm going to stress that. And then I say that and people think, oh, she thinks that she's, yes, I do. I'm sorry. I check my opinion and I check my ego at the door. Okay. It's not about me. And it's not about turning my students into a bunch of walking me's. Okay. No, I want them to be them. I want them to understand what Zionism means to them, how they connect to Israel, not how I, or how they connect to Israel through me. No. And my opinions don't matter. One of the biggest problems that I've seen with Israel education, going around, traveling to schools, talking to teachers, seeing how teachers interject sometimes into my talks that I give in high schools, tells me everything about how they teach their opinion, which is incredibly dangerous because it doesn't give a student the ability to actually critically think. It makes them think that they have the answer. Okay. And with most of these things, there isn't an answer. There's many different perspectives, and you have to figure out which perspective you believe in. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be teaching kids not what to think, but how to think about Israel.
So you're telling me that they brought you as a speaker to a school or a place where you have students listening and somebody interjected to correct you on something?
Yes, on a number of occasions, by the way. And the thing that they interjected and corrected me on was just patently false or, I mean, sometimes borderline racist. I mean, I have one very clear memory, and I will not say which school this is. I won't even tell you what country this happened in because I really don't want to call anyone out. But I was brought to a school. First of all, the person who brought me in was a gym teacher. She had to use every pull that she had to try to get me into this school. And she was able to organize like something that wasn't even mandatory, like that older years of 11, 12 graders would be able to come to. Anyway, we went, we did it. Two teachers came and sat. There weren't that many students. It was probably a total of 30 of us. And I was talking about extremist violence that's taking place in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank coming from residents of the West Bank. And I'm already being very careful about my language because as soon as I use the word settler, people will all of a sudden turn off their brains. And I just want to be clear, like, I don't say that in a derogatory way. Actually, most of the settlers that I know refer to themselves as settlers as a point of pride, but it's heard differently in the diaspora. So I have sensitivity to that. Either way, I was talking about this issue that is a growing problem. It's not something to ignore. It is something that we need to be talking about. We don't have to necessarily only talk about it and put a big highlight and a big arrow over it saying this is the main focus. No, there are other issues, but this is an issue. And as I'm talking about how it's getting worse and how we are seeing more and more incidents, especially since October 7th, I have these two teachers sitting in front of me just shaking their heads the whole time. Just shaking their heads. And this isn't a big group. They're in bleachers. Like they're right there in the front row. All of the students can see these teachers aggressively shaking their heads back and forth, disagreeing. And I actually called them out and I just said, why are you shaking your head? Everything that I'm saying is true. No, it's not. No, it's not. That's not true. It's not a real thing. You're completely making this up. Do you want to see the evidence? I said, with all due respect, I understand that this is an uncomfortable conversation for us to have. I understand that it's hard for us to acknowledge that there are people who are technically on our side, and I'm making air quotes because I think that's a very big loaded term, the idea of being on my side, but that there are people who can call themselves Zionists who are doing this. And I understand that's hard for us, other Zionists who don't do those things, to accept that's happening, but it is. And when you shake your head in front of students, and make them think that I'm just some crazy lefty who's here to share, which is, you will never know my politics walking in and out of a classroom of mine. You will never know where I stand politically because sometimes I say things that lean to the right and some things I say things that lean to the left. You know why? Because facts sometimes lean to the right and facts sometimes lean to the left. And my classes are fact driven. And these are facts. And I can show you the statistics. But there they were shaking their head, getting into an argument. And then worse, they said, okay, well, it's your time's up. So you need to stop. And I'm looking around and nobody's moving. And no other teacher said anything. So I keep going. And then I find out that actually I still had 10 more minutes. So this is active participation in trying to misinform our own students because it didn't fit these teachers' political agenda.
I am so glad that you share that story because when you mentioned it, I actually assumed that somebody's critique was that you were too conservative in what you shared. That's what I assumed would have been their gripe with you. But it's actually the opposite. And I think it highlights the importance of the work that we have to do within. And you don't know this about me, but I also lived in the West Bank. I lived in a village called Eli next to a city called Ariel. I was there as a kid.
Yeah.
So my relatives are considered settlers, and their perspective on the conflict is very similar to what you would agree with because it's based in facts. What's happening in the West Bank is a problem for Israel's national security, and it is a short-sighted, dangerous road that we're going down on. And anybody who disagrees with that is being dishonest about the conditions that we are in.
I mean, again, let's analyze what you just said, because I might agree or disagree because you drew a conclusion, okay? And this is, again, goes back to education. It's here are the facts, but I'm going to hold back on drawing that conclusion for you, right? I'm going to lay them all down and let you decide because you said this is a grave matter of national security. Maybe other people might argue, no, it's a thing. It's happening. I fully agree with the facts. I disagree that it's that big of an issue, right? And we can have those arguments, right? And your family in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, might be more sensitive to it as people who call themselves settlers, who say, well, these people are misrepresenting us. And they might have a more aggressive tone towards that radical fringe group because they are representing them. And what I'm just trying to say is, with everything that I try to do, I try my best to not prescribe a solution or a conclusion. I try to help my students come to that conclusion on their own, whatever that conclusion might be. And they might say, I totally hear you. I had no idea that there were this many attacks happening by Jews in the West Bank against Palestinians. I didn't know that was a thing. I'm going to look into it more. I do still think they might say that Hamas is the bigger problem right now, or I do still think that, whatever it is. And you can feel that way and you can think that way. And that's learning. And again, I think the biggest piece is pushing people to not necessarily come to a big conclusion, but getting them to take in the evidence, the facts, learn it, and help their opinion constantly evolve and kind of be fluid. It needs to be constantly fluid. And once you draw a certain conclusion and you stick with that conclusion, that's how we end up with fundamentalists. That's how you end up with extremists, right? Is then no new information is going to alter your perspective, right? Your understanding of things. And that's dangerous. And so I always say to people, even if you've come to that conclusion, I will, even if I agree with the student, I will still try to play devil's advocate just to get them to think through it more. Because that's, again, what we're lacking in education, period, is critical thinking.
And maybe it's because education has turned into teaching ideology as opposed
indoctrination.
Yeah, this is exactly what you're talking about. And you illustrated a great example. There are many layers to Israel education and Jewish education. There are many things you could teach about. I'm also curious to know about anti-Semitism. What are the trends that you're seeing regarding anti-Semitism, and how do you think we can best counteract the crazy uptick that we're seeing?
So, in terms of trends, I will say as a historian, what happened post October 7th really shook me because it didn't fit the trend. It didn't fit the norm of history, which was that something horrible would happen to the Jews in some place, right? The Jews would flee that place, go to another place, kind of start to rebuild. They would get to a point of comfort. They usually would get to a point of success. And with that success came more anti-Semitism, right? Because now I can scapegoat the Jews, because if they're successful, then I can blame them for ills of society, right? That's the common trend. And that happened consistently throughout the world, where usually, again, that rise of anti-Semitism would lead to some calamity, and then it would go dormant for a little while, and then it would pick up again. And that happened, obviously, most recently with the Holocaust, right? Like, it was this horrific case of anti-Semitism that ended up really being broadcast, right? For the first time, we actually had the images that people eventually will consume. And then there was this major decline in, like, the sense of you can't be an anti-Semite. You just can't. Like, from the late 40s onwards, it was like, you cannot be accused of being anti-Semitic. Even if you're going to do it, you're going to do it quietly. You're going to do it in certain spaces. And then, of course, we got to that point of comfort and privilege. Again, that word that I'm using very intentionally, because that's the word of today, right? The buzzword of privilege. And anti-Semitism was rising. And then comes up October 7th, which should have been the calamity that led to everyone kind of pulling back and saying, whoa, hold on. This went too far, right? But it didn't. It did the opposite, actually. And the reason, I think, which is why I can't talk about trends anymore, because now we're in a different state of affairs for the Jewish people, is that the X factor that was different is that we had Israel. And that the new anti-Semitism, right, the manifestation of anti-Semitism that we see coming from the left, from the far left, is anti-Zionism. As opposed to, and let me stress left wing versus right wing really quickly. It's kind of, Barry Weiss talks about it in her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, the idea of Purim anti-Semitism versus Hanukkah anti-Semitism, or right wing versus left wing. Right wing being very blatant, very in your face. We hate the Jews, kill the Jews. It's the guys marching in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us. It's white replacement theory. It's all that stuff. They're not shy about it. Right-wing anti-Semites are proud to be anti-Semitic. They believe they're doing the world a favor by trying to get rid of the Jews, right? Left-wing anti-Semitism has always been veiled. We don't hate the Jews, we just hate this thing about the Jews, right? And they create the horrible dynamic of the good Jew and the bad Jew, which in their minds, the good Jew is the Jew who sheds whatever it is, that thing that I hate about them, right? So the converso Jews were the good Jews ultimately, right? Because they had shed their Judaism and they adopted Christianity. Right? And they were the good Jews, and the bad Jews were the ones who were in hiding, right? Or who didn't, who were killed, right? Today, the good Jew is the anti-Zionist Jew, and the bad Jew is the Zionist Jew. And with Israel, what it allowed for is everyone to have that shield of being able to say, I don't hate Jews. I just hate Zionists. And so the new trend is difficult because now you can just lump all Jews under that banner. And what I think we need to do to a certain extent is we need to make anti Zionism the same as anti Semitism, but not in the way that the older generation is doing it. The older generation says anti Zionism is anti Semitism. And most people, and not just the younger generation, but most people are very adverse to absolutes because there are few and far between in this world. And that is an absolute. It's also, if I'm thinking about it from a math perspective, it's an equation. Anti Zionism equals anti Semitism, which then would mean that if A equals B, then B equals A. That anti Semitism equals anti Zionism, which you can't say. Anti Zionism is a form of anti Semitism, but it should be seen as just as bad as anti Semitism. And that's where I would say, again, don't say anti Zionism is anti Semitism. This, again, goes to the education I'm trying to teach, which is just instilling nuance, right? I use 4 words when it comes to the education, which is fact-based, nuanced, transparent, and accessible. That's what I want. That's the conversation I want to be having. And so when I say to students, I did this last week, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Some people are like, yes, and other, there's not consensus at all. And then I said, okay, how about this? Is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? Collectively, all at once, yes. Just a slight bit of nuance. And now why? Hold on. Why is it a form of anti-Semitism? Because, well, first on the fundamental level, if you're going after the Jewish state and only the Jewish state and not any other nation state, and by the way, the term ethno-state, which was just made up recently, it's just a nation state. It's literally just, it's a nation state is a euphemism, if you will, for ethno-state. Ethno-state is just a dirtier way of saying nation state, which was not a dirty thing and is not seen as a dirty thing with any other nation state in the world other than the only country that's ever referred to as an ethno-state, which is Israel. Just throwing that out there. But the idea of you targeting only the Jewish state and no other nation state, that's you singling out the Jews, and that's anti-Semitism on the most basic level. On another level, it's the majority of people out there in the world were never anti-Semitic. They just weren't. It wasn't their priority. They didn't think about Jews. They didn't preoccupy themselves with Jews. They never thought about it. But in every generation, at some point, people rose up to destroy the Jews, right? To kill the Jews, to harm the Jews in some way or another. And what we have to realize is that in the history of the world, it was always the minority that rose up against the Jews, right? It wasn't the vast majority of people who were going with their pitchforks trying to kill and torture Jews. But when the minority was doing that, the majority sat back and let it happen. And that's why anti-Zionism to me can be just as bad as anti-Semitism, because you might not be the perpetrator, but you're the bystander who's going to eliminate the only place in the world that's really there to keep Jews safe, that has the Jews as a top priority. And you're going to then open the Jews to being vulnerable to another attack without any country holding them as a priority, which 80 years ago demonstrated exactly what could happen in those circumstances. And you're going to sit back then and watch as the Jews are being killed, and you're not going to stop it because it's not your issue. But you've taken away my one refuge. You've taken away the one place that's meant to be my protection. And so again, my education is so much about, I was just on a podcast and this guy asked me, he said, so what are you trying, every education always has an agenda. What's your agenda? And I said, my agenda is to create more Zionists in the world. Now, I don't care what kind of Zionist. You could be a left-wing Zionist, you could be a right-wing, religious, secular, communist, socialist, capitalist. I don't care. I just want more people in the world to understand why Zionism is a right and it's a necessity. The Jews have a right to self-determination. It is a necessity for the Jews because in every generation you have tried to kill us. And the majority of you didn't try to stop it. And that's really the key, is it's not that there's always been people who have tried to kill us. It's that the majority watched them do it. So today, anti-Semitism, it's a whole nother ballgame because we have this power base that is Israel, which makes people feel like they have free reign to be against the Zionist Jews, which is over 90% of Jews in the world. And to stop it, I would say the only way is everyone needs to buckle up and need to realize that every single one of us has a role to play in this, because here's the thing. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism almost always comes not from a place of malice, but from a place of ignorance. And while malice is a lot harder to solve, hatred, deep-seated hatred, that's like deprogramming. It can happen, but you need to be an expert. Just helping somebody better understand who we are is something every single one of us can do. That is in conversations with people. That's making sure that when I'm having conversations, I'm bringing up Jews, I'm bringing up Israel, I'm bringing up anti-Semitism. And people say, well, that's uncomfortable. Yeah, it is. Get uncomfortable. Welcome. You know what's more uncomfortable? Being killed for being a Jew. So we're not there yet, but we're going to get there if we don't do something now. So everyone's like, oh, it's uncomfortable. And do I really want to? Okay, again, If you don't do it now, it's just going to get worse. And then it's going to be uncomfortable to be a Jew, let alone to talk about the fact that you are a Jew. And again, it goes back to, how do we get people there? Pride. And pride comes from knowledge. And with more pride and more knowledge comes courage. And that's what we need. That's what the JEI, what Jerusalem Education Institute wants to instill, is pride comes from a very young age. And with more knowledge comes more pride. And that's cyclical. Okay. And it'll also temper your pride. It won't be too proud, because you'll learn about the bad. You'll learn about the parts where we're not perfect. We're not the chosen people. None of us, most Jews never refer to us as that, because it's a horrible notion when you really think about it. That's not who we are. We have our faults, but with more pride comes more knowledge. Tempered pride, because with more knowledge comes tempered, good, positive pride. And then comes the courage. And once you have the courage, man, it's not a matter of, oh, I guess I'll have this conversation. It's, I want to have this conversation everywhere and anywhere that I can, because I just want people to understand us better, because I understand that with more understanding comes less hatred. If every Jew in the world, or let's say at least half of us who are actually engaged with the world, would do this, that's 7 million people out there who can impact one person a day. That's 7 million people who can be impacted. You got to think about it that way. That's how we're going to make change.
I love the frameworks that you've created to talk about these things and to teach these things to people. As I was hearing you speak, I realized that my perception of the history of the role of the Jew throughout time is a little bit different than yours. And here's what I mean by that. To me, the Jews have always been in the way of some larger power or some group of people trying to get some kind of goal. And the getting rid of the Jews is one of the mechanisms that is, in their opinion, required in order to achieve control or domination. You talked about how throughout history there's always been this calamity, right? And then we kind of took a step back and we're like, okay, never mind, or we got to do something else. I actually think that nobody changed their minds after the calamity happened, and that the Holocaust was the first time that people actually were like, wait, oh shit, okay, now we have to view Jews differently.
A couple of things. I don't think people changed their minds. I think some people might have, but mostly I just said it went dormant. Like, I still feel that way about Jews, but I can't say it publicly. That's more what I think went down. I will say your characterization of anti-Semitism, I think that sometimes is true. For Hitler, for the Nazis, it was absolutely true, right? They wanted this Aryan race, this dominant race. Judaism, I mean, just read the Torah. How many times do we talk about taking care of the weak, right? The orphan, the widow. This is the exact opposite of what Hitler believed. So you can't have this moral people who are here to help the weak. They can't be a part of this world that I'm trying to build, because my whole world is about getting rid of the weak, right?
That is also the case for the Soviet Union and for the Roman Empire. There's always been some dimension
Right.
of Judaism that does not fit with whatever the agenda is of the party in power.
Right. Well, I would just say the broadest way of saying that isn't even just something about the Jew. It's just the Jew themselves, the idea of Judaism. Within Jewish culture, we're encouraged to argue and debate, right? That's the entire Talmud. Like that is what our learning is. When we sit down and we learn Jew versus Jew, or Jew on Jew, we call it chavruta, which the root of that is chaver, is friend. This is me having a friendly argument, essentially, in debate about something. And when you come from any of those societies that you just listed, which were in a sense had, well, fascists being the Nazis, but this idea of there's one way of thinking and you need to think the way that we think, the last thing you want is a people who are encouraging pluralism, multiple thoughts at one time, and critical thinking. But the other thing that I would say is also sometimes why I was like, maybe, but there was also just sometimes it's just the Jews were an inconvenience, or more importantly, the Jews were, they would argue, had too much power, meaning too much influence, because oftentimes Jews did grow in influence because of their financial connections, the way in which they could do trade, and how they became economic powerhouses in the places they lived in, which then I would just say made them easy scapegoats. So sometimes it also wasn't even something about the Jew that was a real thing. It was a made up thing about the Jew that was then used against the Jew. So I just wanted, sometimes it was true that it was something real about the Jews, like the Nazis, where we were these people who believed in protecting the weak, and that went completely against Nazi ideology. But in other cases, it was something made up about the Jew. The Jew has too much influence and power, and they're using that power for evil. That's like where you jump to, well, that's not true. Maybe they have power and influence, but they're not using it for evil. And that's the jump that some people would make. So I just wanted to clarify. We're basically on the same page. But yeah, I do want to stress, like, the idea that people just just let go of those thoughts when the calamity would happen. No, they just realized I have to shut up about it for a little while. It's not popular right now to be against the Jews. Look at what we just did to them. But with Germany was the only place where we actually started to see a change, I think, in ideology, just because they actually started to teach against Nazi ideology. Whereas in other European countries, they never did that. And so people maintained those ideas about Jews. They just learned to not say them out loud.
And I'll add again back to the Soviet Union that this notion that anti Zionism is different from anti Semitism has been around since, I don't know, the 40s or whatever.
Well, they created it. Let's be honest. I mean, it was the PLO and Yasser Arafat. I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on that. And I actually highly recommend people reading. There's a great book, Gil Troy, who's one of my mentors and one of my favorite scholars out there. He wrote a book called Moynihan's Moment. I know that's hard to hear and absorb, but Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he was the ambassador to the UN in 1975 for the United States when the UN passed the resolution, Zionism is racism. And so Gil wrote this book about Moynihan's moment when he got up and he basically said, we're not going to abide by this resolution. But more importantly, what it does is it traces the history of how we got to that resolution being passed. And it talks all about the Soviet Union working with Yasser Arafat and the PLO and how they changed the propaganda to feed that narrative that eventually got the UN to pass that resolution and changed this conflict from being a national conflict, which is what it was, to being a racial conflict, which it never was and still is not until today, a racial conflict, which is why notions of apartheid are just ridiculous. Yes, there is racism. I'm not saying there isn't racism, but the idea that the conflict revolves around racism is a complete ignoring of the conflict. If anything, I would say it was a national conflict, and now it has also evolved into a religious conflict for some, but not for all. But yeah, so it does go back, and the Soviets were planting that for a long time, the idea that they're two separate things. So it's okay to be an anti-Zionist, right? But just not an anti-Semite. And the Soviets were really good about trying to say, we're not against Jews, we're against all religions, or we're not, right? They were very good at trying to avoid the anti-Semitism label after World War II because it was such a toxic label. And they understood that. Now we're back into a place where it's not really a toxic label anymore. It's just not. Like, you can have millions of followers like Candace Owens and you can say anti-Semitic things almost every single day and get away with it. And it's not even hidden anti-Semitism. It's blatant anti-Semitism. She talks about Jews. She doesn't talk about Zionists, and it's okay. So we're shifting into a very dangerous place now when it comes to anti-Semitism.
I do think it's related to what you talked about, which is this idea of dissent and difference of opinion and thought. We are kind of starting to converge in America into a society, and this has happened even when I was in college, where difference of opinion and difference of thought makes you a bigot or a racist or ignorant or privileged. And we're seeing the consequences of that.
I hate to, no, we have to bring it up. The murder of Charlie Kirk really shook me. And it says everything about where we are at. I'm like tearing up thinking about it. And I wasn't the biggest fan of Charlie. I disagreed with so many of his points. I'm not that conservative. You can figure out try to figure out where I fall politically, but there were some things that I just really didn't believe. But I mean, the guy just wanted to have conversations. And yes, he could be condescending sometimes and he could make people feel stupid, which at the same time, like, don't show up to a debate and not be prepared. And when you show up to a debate not prepared, you're going to make yourself look stupid. Charlie just had a way of being able to emphasize that. But the fact that he took a bullet to the neck and that there were people celebrating it says everything about where we are. And it doesn't matter what side it comes from. It doesn't matter. And that's the part that's also so frustrating about where we are at, that I just wished we had leadership that could stop and say, this is bad no matter where it's coming from. I was so angry. I wish somebody could have pulled Trump in and just said, don't say radical left. Don't say this is happening across the board and it needs to stop across the board. And where it's coming from is, like you said, if I disagree with somebody, it's now not just we have different values, right? Which is what it used to be. Now it's they're evil and I'm going to dehumanize them to the point that then their murder is something that I can celebrate. And that's the beginning of the end of a society. I mean, that was Germany. It was the dehumanization of the Jews that then, while the Jews were being murdered, people didn't really care that much because in their minds, the Jews were no longer human. And so we're in a very dangerous place. And again, academia, which is the space in which is supposed to be open to critical thought. And that's why I said professors, teachers, everyone You got to check your ego at the door. You got to check your opinions at the door. Because if you think that you're right, you're a narcissist. And if you think that you're so right that you have to teach all of these minions of yours to think like you're a narcissist. You're not actually a professor. You're not seeking higher learning or higher education. This is indoctrination, what you're doing. And you're not wrong about the infiltration into our universities. I wouldn't say yet that it's happening on the high school level, but like in a different way. It's more just like teachers expressing their opinions. We have yet to see a full infiltration into curriculum, but it's happening. And in a very scary way, it's happening. And again, when you say that, all of a sudden you sound like a crazy person. But I think we have to normalize the conversation and use terms like maybe not infiltrate because it sounds so, and I'm all about using like euphemisms to help people be able
drama, though, it adds the drama.
I know it's the difference between like journalism and education, where I don't need like a catch, right? And you're not wrong. Again, that's the key, right? About where I say accessible, when I say those 4 words that I use to hone my education that I'm trying to provide at the JEI, it's accessible means that it enables the person who might disagree or might be adverse to what you're saying to still be able to hear what you're saying. And that's not caving. Some people think like Ben Shapiro would say that's just caving, right? No, I'm just going to tell it how it is. And I get that perspective, but you're not going to win anyone over. You're not going to influence anybody with that kind of so you can do it if you're debating and you want to be right, right? Debate is about winning, okay? Education, instilling, imparting on someone more knowledge and more information, that's a different ballgame. And that's about influence. And so when you talk about it, like it's not that they're infiltrating, it's that unfortunately, a certain curriculum, a certain ideology has taken over within our universities, and professors are in an echo chamber now, and they have around them just constant confirmation bias. And the professors who did try to speak up and say, well, I think I have a different perspective, were shut down because they were the minority. And so it's not so much an infiltration so much as it's an ideology that has taken over. And then, yes, has there been maybe funding from certain countries that have helped aid and abet that process? Yes, but I also want us to grasp that it's not just that. That if you removed Qatari money and other money from our university systems, that's not going to solve the problem. Because there are professors who are homegrown American professors who deeply have bought into this ideology and refuse to see any other side, any other perspective. And again, it goes back to because my side is right and therefore your side is evil. And most importantly, this ideology all revolves around the idea of an oppressor and an oppressed. I'm sorry, again, let's go back to absolutes. That's just dangerous to live in a world where there's only 2 categories. And the funniest part is these are the same people who would say that everything is non-binary. Everything's fluid. Everything has fluidity to it. There's nothing binary. There's no black and whites. But in this case, there's just you're an oppressor or an oppressed. Which one do you want to be? And that is, when it comes to the Jewish people, a very dangerous ideology. And I would say when it comes to any group that is currently being victimized, it is not giving them a way forward. It's giving them a way of maintaining their victimhood and not growing out of it because, well, if you grow out of it and you're no longer a victim, what are you? Right? You're an oppressor. It's a very easy ideology, I think, to be consumed by with good intentions. If you have good intentions, you could be consumed by it because your intentions might be, again, to protect the weak, to want to give more to those who you feel have been discriminated against or oppressed or downtrodden. And so it's coming from a beautiful place, but it's leading to disastrous results based on a dangerous ideology that's feeding that narrative.
This brings me naturally to your incident at Auschwitz, which shook me to the core. In the introduction, I walked the listener through roughly what happened. I mean, it's crazy. The whole thing is crazy. And watching it, I was like, the only silver lining, which you would say is crazy to even think that there was a silver lining, but thank God this was recorded. Thank God that this was on camera, is all I felt when I was watching that video. Now that it's been a few months, you are now kind of in a new headspace. You are a new chapter of your life. What do you make of it? And is there anything you want to share now that the dust has settled on that?
So it's been a month, by the way. You say a few months. It's been 1 month, which is crazy to think about. Yeah, it's been just about 4 weeks. Look, first of all, I will say I really didn't think that there were a lot of things out there in the world of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism that could shock me. That was a whole new low. I thought this could happen in so many places. I wear my Jewish star. I wear my dog. I'm very out and proud as a Zionist everywhere I go. I wear it on my sleeve. And so I expected it could happen anywhere. I never thought that it could happen on the train tracks of Auschwitz. Okay. A few things. Silver lining, I actually did. There was one huge silver lining, which was the students at the end who didn't let this moment destroy them, but instead they started to sing Am Yisrael Chai proudly in front of this person's face, basically saying, no matter what you say, you're not going to put us down. You're just not. And that's honestly, in that moment, that's all we were able to really achieve. Now, I will say, I've watched that video back many times, obviously. And all I can tell you is that I'm just hypercritical of myself the whole time. And that's because I teach people how to have calm, civil conversations. That's my job. That's what I try to teach people how to do. And I had the opposite of a calm, civilized conversation. It was everything about it. My emotions completely took over. And that is what I always teach my students. You have to do everything in your power to not allow that to happen. Now, again, everyone was forgiving. Obviously, this happened on the train tracks of Auschwitz. You could never, like, most Jews come out of Auschwitz and they can barely formulate a sentence, let alone, like, in that moment be attacked and be able to stay as calm as I did, even though I didn't feel calm at all watching myself back. I wish that I could have had a conversation. I wish that I could have said, why do you think I should be embarrassed about this flag? I guess very quickly when she started to say, you're killing children, I think maybe I realized this wasn't going to be a conversation. And I did try to end it right at the beginning. I mean, I don't know if you saw the whole video, but the first thing I said was like, please don't do this here. Like there was almost a begging of like, please not here, not in front of Jewish, just walk away, trying to just to end it, knowing like I couldn't handle it. But I will say, yes, I'm glad it was recorded for, if no other reason, that Jews felt more proud watching it, that it showed how in really difficult moments you can still stand up for yourself. That I know that if I had walked away, I would have reinforced what she believed, which was the last thing I would have wanted to do. But I really do wish that I could have had a conversation. But there's something really, I think, that we could pull from it that I think is the most important thing, which is that girl insisted that she loved Jews. She said it 3 times. I love Jews. I love Jews, she said. And I said, so what do you not like? And yeah, I put words in her mouth, but she validated it when I said, so what do you not like? You don't like Zionists? And then I said, you just don't like Jews who believe that they should have a country? And her response was, these are the words of a Zionist. Yeah, they are the words of a Zionist. But again, what I take away from it was that girl, throughout that entire exchange, throughout her entire time walking through Auschwitz in a crop top, can I just point out, I'm sorry, like the next generation needs to learn like what respect means. Putting that aside, but she walked through all of Auschwitz, walks out, even after that exchange, probably walked away saying, I don't have a problem with Jews. I have a problem with Zionists. And that's the world that we live in. And that's what people need to take away from this is I don't think is actually an anti-Semite. I wouldn't give her that label. I would say she, unbeknownst to her, is espousing anti-Semitism. And that is it's something so deep that Jews should take in to realize that there are a lot of people out there who espouse anti-Semitic ideas, but they do not hold malice towards Jews. And I know that might sound crazy and people might say she's naive or that's too idealistic, but I'm a firm believer that's true. And that's why I believe that so much of this comes from ignorance, not from malice. And that if I could have another conversation with that girl in a calmer place, that I think I could get her to the point where she would say, okay, you know what? I don't have a problem with Jews and I don't have a problem with Zionists. I have a problem with Israeli policies right now. Awesome. Great. You can go to Tel Aviv every Saturday night. You could join a whole bunch of people who feel exactly the same way, who are waving Israeli flags. And Jews around the world have to believe that they can do that they can get somebody from that place of saying, I love Jews. I just hate Zionists, to them saying, no, you know what? I love Jews. I also don't have a problem with Zionists, maybe some Zionists, but I'll only know if I ask. And that's really the key, is enough of the labeling and the thinking that because I have the word Zionist as part of my identity, that tells you anything about me other than that I believe in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Everything else, you have to ask me, well, what kind of Zionist are you? What do you believe should be the solution to the conflict? What kind of country should Israel be? More religious, more secular? All of these are important questions, but we don't get there with people because we assume things about them and then we write them off. And more than anything, what I think I learned from that video is, again, I wish I could have stayed calm, but I am such a firm believer that that girl was not an anti-Semite. She had expressions of anti-Semitism that if I had an hour conversation with her, I don't think she would be expressing anymore. And I want Jews to walk away knowing that they can do that too. You just got to have the knowledge. And most importantly, you have to have the patience to be able to do it and the will to do it.
I have to say that the part that makes me most optimistic about this challenging time is seeing those kids respond by singing Am Yisrael High, because that means that our children understand what's going on. They want to participate in Jewish life and in Israeli pride and Jewish pride, and that matters. And that gives me a lot of hope.
They
And
were rock stars. Sorry. I just thought they were, first of all, I love these kids. I want to send them to them. I loved them. I wasn't even with them. I was with them for a day and a half. Like I joined them on Saturday for a few things. We talked a little bit and I joined them in Auschwitz. And then the last thing, I really want to give a big shout out to the rabbi. It's Jewish education done right. What he did with those students throughout Poland and what he did with us in Auschwitz left us with an experience that was grief ridden and yet also prideful at the same time, which most people would say, how can you feel both? How can you be both a victim and a survivor at the same time? That is the Jewish people. And you know what we did? We were victims. We acknowledged our victimhood walking around Auschwitz and what was done to the Jewish people. And in moments, yeah, we sang songs like Vihi Shamda, and every generation they rise up to destroy us. But then we end by saying, God protects us. God takes care of us. We stood up, we sang Hatikva. We walked and we sang Tov Lahodot, so that we give thanks to God. How? In a place where this happened, how? And then lastly, sorry, I just have to say this. We walked out of Auschwitz and the rabbi said, I want to walk out together. And we lined up in 3 rows. We weren't that many people. And the front, they were holding the Israeli flag as well. And we walked out singing Am Yisrael Chai. And we walked out of a barrack singing. We walked past a bunch of groups that were looking at us like we were animals in a zoo. Oh my God, live Jews, live ones, right? Like here are all the dead ones like Daryl Horn talks about. We love these guys, but holy moly, these are live Jews. And I saw people getting emotional. And then when we walked out of those gates, we checked the victimhood at the gate. We stepped outside and we started to sing Am Yisrael Chai loudly in circles, dancing in celebration of our survival. And it wasn't 20 minutes after that incident happened. And so I give all the credit to the rabbi who led us, Rav Shiloni from Beit Shemesh, huge shout out, because this man has perfected what it is to look at our past and acknowledge our past, but also acknowledge where we are today. And that instilled in those students a pride that was completely demonstrated in that moment towards that woman and what they did. So again, huge shout out to the students and to the rabbi who created and really curated that experience that led them to be able to do what they did at the end. And that's it. And that's the whole point of what I'm trying to do is it all goes back to pride. It all goes back to pride and knowledge and then courage. And that pride and that knowledge that they had in that moment gave them the courage to stand there and speak up for themselves and not cower and not walk away and eventually start singing the greatest song of Jewish pride, Am Yisrael Chai.
I have like chills and I'm tearing up, and the whole thing, it just makes me very emotional. And I can only imagine what it was like to actually be there in person. I'm excited to see what's ahead for you. This is just the beginning. Let me tell you, this work that you're doing to educate students, I think it's going to be monumental. We need it more than ever. Tell me, how can people connect with you and learn more about your work?
Great. So first of all, our website is jerusalemEDU.org. So Jerusalem Education Institute. You can also Google us and we'll pop up on Google. JEI for short. All of our usernames on all of our social media platforms is Jerusalem EDU. So please follow us. We are still slowly trickling out content. I will be very honest. Our operation right now is me and my director of operations, and that is it. And so the biggest way that you could also support us is through donations to help us be able to continue to grow and build a team out of educators, of consultants, of people who can put out incredible content on Israel, on Zionism. So again, through our website, there's a donate button there. You could donate. But again, following us on our platforms, you could follow me as well. I try to put out all constant information, but I filter what I put out on the JEI page and what I put out on my own page, because again, opinions versus facts and trying to find that very delicate but very important balance. But that's how you can get in touch with us. A little teaser trailer, if you will, but we are in the process of producing a masterclass. It's already filmed. It's in post-production. So hopefully that'll be coming out before the end of the year. And it's a 6-part course It's an hour long each, so 6 hours total, taking a deep dive into Israeli history, Middle Eastern history, going all the way back to ancient times, coming all the way to modern times. I produced it in March, and it literally goes up to March of 2025. But that's a little teaser, and if you follow us, you'll be able to see when we put that out. It'll be available for purchase, and we can also license it to different organizations if they want to use it internally or be able to disseminate it to their supporters. That's another way of being able to access it. But that's just the beginning of the education that we want to be able to provide. I want to stress social media is an amazing tool, but it needs to be seen as a tool and not as the ends. And too much, unfortunately, too many organizations have fallen for this idea that, well, everyone has a short attention span, so we just have to do everything on social media and we have to make everything bite-sized. No, social media needs to be a tool. It needs to be a means to an end, not the end. And so what we're really trying to do, if you follow us, it's the hardest part. And everyone would say this is so not the social media way, but I want you there on our platform. And then I want to take you off of our platform. I want to get you off of social media. I want to say, this is what I'm reading this week. And I want you to go and I want you to buy a book and I want you to read that book. Or I want you to read this longer article that I'm going to suggest or this podcast that I'm going to suggest. Because here's the thing, to all the educators out there, sound bites it's not education. It's activism. Okay. If a kid understands what genocide is, he will much more be able to answer the question of, is Israel's committing a genocide or not? And they're not. But once you understand it, I don't need to give you the soundbite anymore because you understand it deeply. And that's the kind of education that we need to be providing. So yes, I'll say go to our social media and follow us, but just know I'm going to do everything in my power to try to take you off of social media so that you can deepen your understanding and get real, true education and knowledge so that we together as a team, as a movement can go out there and make real change with real conversations. And real conversations don't start and end with sound bites. They just don't. You need more. We need more.
This is really excellent. I can't wait to see the masterclass. And I have one final question for you. It's one that I ask every single guest. Who would you like to nominate for People Jew Want to Know?
Oh my gosh. What I would say is not influencers. And I know that some influencers are going to hate me, but that's what I'm going to say is not influencers. Because if you label yourself an influencer, you're going to have a problem. Sorry. You know what? You know who you should talk to? A true Zionist who knows most people don't know? A guy named Eyal Dror. Eyal Dror wrote a book. I wish I had it. It's in my suitcase. I just brought it back from Israel called Embracing the Enemy. And I was just recently visiting him. He lives on the Lebanese border. Like he lives in a place called Dafna, which is a kibbutz on the Lebanese border. He was evacuated for 16 months. And his job prior was he was a colonel in the Israeli military. Colonel, I believe he was a colonel. Don't quote me on that one. But he was a major in the Israeli military who was responsible for bringing Syrian refugees into Israel and giving them medical treatment during the Syrian civil war. He organized that whole Operation Good Neighbor. And he wrote an amazing book, and he still guides groups in the north and helps them better understand the northern borders and the challenges on the northern borders. And most importantly, he's a real Zionist. He's just such a good person and such a great voice, and he doesn't get enough love. So maybe check out Eyal Dror, Embracing the Enemy. He has an amazing story, and he has depths of knowledge when it comes to the northern borders and what has gone on there in the last 50, 70 years. So a big shout out to my buddy Eyal Dror.
Thank you so much for this wonderful nomination. I have one request for you.
Sure.
Maybe you've already done this. I would like to ask for a list of books that you recommend.
Oh, easy. Go to the JEI website, JerusalemEDU.org, and go to resources, and there's book recommendations. And if you buy them from our website, which would take you to Amazon, we even get a little bit small commission. So put it in the show notes, whatever it is, but those are my book. Yes, it's my favorite question ever. And by the way, you know how I know my education is effective? When a high school student comes up to me and says, do you have a reading list? Not a podcast list, not who's the person I should follow on social media, but do you have a reading list? It is my favorite question. And so of course we have one. Book recommendations on our website. You can find it. And I would start from the beginning and just kind of work your way down if you haven't read them. But yeah, they're really good. They're really thoughtful. And there are some on the Palestinian narrative as well, which might piss people off, but it's important to expose yourself to the Palestinian side and their perspective, their history, their understanding of their connection to that land. All of those things are going to change the way that you understand Israel and understand Zionism once you understand it from their perspective as well. And not even that, just understand their perspective, period, and their history and their existence in that land and what it has meant to them. So that's also on there. So you'll get a wide range.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Jew Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, Follow us on Instagram at People You Want to Know.